Hello and good evening. My name is Daniel Collick and I'm a member of the selection committee for this festival. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for tonight, Scott Abramson, who will provide context, the film and the characters and the world they live in. Scott Abramson is a historian of the modern Middle East, a postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern University's Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies, and he's also the author of numerous articles in scholarly journals and popular publications. His forthcoming book, it's provisionally titled Friends Behind Enemy Lines, The History of Israel's Secret Alliance with the Kurds of Iraq, presents the first comprehensive history in English of the Israel-Kurdish partnership against Baghdad in the 1960s and 70s. Scott, thank you for speaking with us tonight. Would you be able to provide a historical context to the film?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I thought it would be instructive if I gave some context as to the political situation and the geographical circumstance of the film. So the film returns us to the late 70s, early 80s. It's not specified exactly, in northeastern Syria. And the setting is laid in Qamishli, which is in fact the outskirts of Qamishli, which is Syria's most multi-ethnic, multi-religious city. As I said, the film unfolds outside of Qamishli, so it's not an urban environment, it's a rather rural one. And these two enemies, the Jews and the Kurds, are, according to the ancient Middle Eastern doctrine of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, rather well disposed to one another. So one of the central ambitions of Damascus was to bring the country under its ironclad control. And to that end, it wasn't just military, but also cultural soft power that was used to ensure that Damascus could exercise authority over the whole of Syria. Now, the demographic complexion of Syria is such that in the Syrian heartland, the interior of the country, Arabs predominate, but on the periphery, alongside the frontiers, minorities cluster. And so in the northeastern part of Syria, where the story unfolds, Kurds predominate. And so to bring this Kurdish populated region under tighter central government control, Damascus would send its operatives to enforce its authority and to inculcate its ideology.
I have to say that film brought up all kinds of emotions for me, which is one of the reasons I really wanted it in this festival. And I'm glad the other members of the committee agreed. It left me sad, left me angry, left me frightened. What I didn't expect, though, was that it made me curious because it was an insight into the lives of people who lived less than a day's drive away from where I used to live, but whose relationship I knew nothing about. So we discussed the historic context, but looking at these relationships, can you walk us through between the Syrians, the Kurds, the Jews, the Turks, etc., a who's who of the parties and how they interact?
Sure. Well, nearly all of the dramatis persona, the cast of characters, are Kurdish, with two major exceptions. The school teacher sent from Damascus to indoctrinate the Kurds and remake them as Arabs is, of course, Arab, naturally enough. And the family of three, Jewish family, is also not Kurdish. They speak Kurdish when they interact with their ethnic Kurdish or Kurdish Muslim neighbors, but they themselves are Jews. Let's see, then there are the border guards who figure only glancingly in the film. And in particular, there are two sets of border guards that we see. The Syrians, the Syrian Arabs, who at one point, of course, tell or command the Kurds to speak Arabic and not Kurdish. And then their Turkish counterparts on the other side of the border, who likewise demand that the Kurds speak Turkish. And then there are the European relief workers, but really just about everyone in the film is Kurdish.
Are there any civil right differences between the different groups? Are there things that Kurds can do that Jews couldn't, or that Syrians could and the Kurds couldn't, and so on? I'm thinking about why this man had to go get an identity card.
Right. Well, Kurds and Jews alike were persecuted, downtrodden by the authorities in Damascus, but no group had it worse in Syria than Jews. And one of the repressive measures that Damascus enforced on Jews in particular was Damascus prevented the Jews from emigrating. So they were in effect held hostage. And it wasn't until the early 90s, thanks in part to pressure brought to bear on Damascus by the first President Bush, that Syrian Jews were at last permitted to emigrate. And there was also a Canadian woman who was instrumental in the effort to free the Syrian Jewish refuseniks, if I can use the Soviet term. So the Kurds, on the other hand, were not subject to the same kind of supervision and liable to the same kind of suspicion that dogged the Jews. And so the Kurds, for the most part, could emigrate and leave the country and return as they saw fit. And that was a privilege denied the Jews.
You mentioned Canadian involvement. Was this Judy Feld-Carr you're talking about?
Yes, exactly.
So as an FYI, but I didn't expect this connection. In the early 80s, I was involved in Jewish student politics, and we were in a conference in LA, and word came out that she had an offer to get people out, but she had to literally bribe them out. Mm-hmm. And we passed buckets around, and we raised a few $1,000s one day, and the next day I was flying back to Toronto, and I had it wrapped in my luggage. Let's think what could look more suspicious, right? I was carrying this wad of cash in my luggage, which I then delivered to Judy Feld-Carr, and she used it to bribe to get people out. So I didn't expect that connection. But do you want to talk perhaps a little bit more about what she was doing? Do you know more about that?
Sure. Well, she was a major fundraiser, as you say, and a political organizer who dedicated herself to the liberation of Syrian Jews. And really the culmination of her efforts, the 1990s brought the culmination of her efforts when the last holdouts of the Syrian Jewish community were finally permitted to emigrate. But at that point, the Syrian Jewish community had been reduced to a mere fraction of what it had been. But there remained a few Jews in Qamishli, in the area where the film unfolds, Aleppo and Damascus being their other major strongholds.
The protagonists in the movie we spoke about primarily were the Jews and the Kurds within the context of other issues. In today's news, now we're talking 40 years later, so some of this, we hear about the Syrian civil war, we hear about Iraqi instability, we hear about Turkey's drift toward authoritarianism, and so it's a rough neighborhood. Throughout all of this, we keep on hearing about Kurdish aspirations towards statehood. Are you able to say a few words about that?
With pleasure. Well, I think it would be instructive if I just began with a brief description of Kurdistan, what it is. So Kurdistan, the land of the Kurds, is, of course, a geographical, not a political entity. And it, if overlaid on a map of a political map of the modern Middle East, then it extends across parts of Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. And these four countries, whose governments have enforced at times a militant form of nationalism, have opposed Kurdish national ambitions vigorously. And so, in fact, this has been one area in which the four governments, who are usually at odds over everything, have come together and found a rare patch of common ground. And so the Kurds have found themselves in the very unenviable position of being landlocked and therefore at the mercy of four governments hostile to their national aspirations. Today, and it's much to be regretted, the Kurds are as far from the realization of their ambitions as ever. And they're as beleaguered as ever. If in Turkey, where 20% of the population is Kurdish, about 15 million people, the Kurds and the government have been in open war since 2015. And that war shows no signs of subsidence. In Iraq, where the Kurds have enjoyed limited autonomy since the early 90s, the Kurds have been reeling from a defeat they suffered in 2017 after they, I would say foolishly, held a referendum, the result of which was that 94% of the Kurds of Iraq aspired to outright independence, not just expanded autonomy. And so that referendum had the result, the ironic result, of provoking Baghdad into sending troops to roll back some of the autonomy, that the hard-won autonomy that the Kurds had gained in recent years. So the Kurds in Iraq still do enjoy autonomy. They have their Kurdistan regional government, but its proportions have been shrunk thanks largely to the backlash to that referendum held in 2017. And in Iraq, incidentally, Kurds are 20% of the population, about, what would it be, about 6 million people overall. In Syria, the Kurds have carved out autonomy since 2012, when the Syrian civil war began. 2011, actually, early 2011. And with the result that the Kurds were able to detach themselves from central government control and rule themselves in a fairly extensive tract of Syria until 2019, when the Americans, who had been in Syria helping the Kurds fight ISIS, withdrew hurriedly. And while that didn't bring an end to Kurdish autonomy in Syria, it did reduce the scope of Kurdish autonomy in Syria, because it gave Trump's withdrawal of American troops gave Turkey a free hand to mount incursions into Syria and to restrict Kurdish autonomy. So in Syria, as in Iraq, the Kurds do enjoy some autonomy, albeit on a smaller scale than they had previously. And lastly, in the fourth country that comprises Kurdistan, Iran, the Kurds are at this very moment under assault because no group has suffered more grievously since the outbreak of the demonstrations in Iran than the Kurds. In fact, the woman, Mahsa Amini, whose death sparked these protests, was herself Kurdish. And the regime has been targeting the Kurds disproportionately, sending reinforcements of the IRGC into Kurdistan, for instance. Kurdistan is an Iranian, the Iranian part of Kurdistan, I mean.
I hasten to mention to people that we're recording this on November 30th, and the news in the Middle East is always fluid. So it may be that it's a very different situation in Iran at the time you're seeing this. Was there a connection at all between the Kurds and Israel, either political or popular support or anything of that nature?
Yes. Between the early 60s and mid 70s, the Kurds of Iraq and Israel maintained an alliance with the Shah's Iran as the kind of go-between. And the alliance was based on mutual antipathy to Baghdad, the oppressor of the Kurds and the implacable enemy of Israel. And Iraq, it will be recalled, though it doesn't share a border with Israel, participated in the 48 war, the 67 war, and the 73 war. And I think it could be said without much protest that no country in the Middle East has been as hostile to Israel for as long as Iraq. Iraq was at the vanguard of what used to be called the rejectionist front. And so to bog down the Iraqi military and to prevent Iraqi mischief at Israel's expense, Israel made common cause with the Kurds of Iraq, whose ambition was to liberate themselves from Baghdad. And so for more than a decade, Israel and the Kurds maintained a very fruitful alliance that yielded many benefits for Israel, not least in the field of intelligence. The Kurds also helped smuggle out of Iraq the last holdouts of Iraq's hugely depopulated Jewish community, which after the Six-Day War came under renewed persecution. The persecution had never relented, but it intensified after the Six-Day War. And the Kurds were in large measure responsible for smuggling Iraqi Jews across the border into the Shah's Iran, which was, of course, friendly to Israel. After 75, when the alliance ended, the relationship between the Kurds and Israel is much more opaque. It's known much more to intelligence officials than to scholars and journalists. But there have been some revelations over the past half century, and some public displays of friendship between Israel and the Kurds. One example, if you'll permit me, was that Israel in 2017, when the Iraqi Kurds held that disastrous referendum that found that 94% of their population wanted independence, Israel was the only country in the world to support Kurdish independence. Israel supported it unreservedly, well, albeit at the rhetorical level. Of course, Israel had nothing to lose, considering three of the four countries where Kurds live in large numbers, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, don't have diplomatic relations with Israel. The one country that does, Turkey, has, if I can say by way of an understatement, troubled relations with Israel.
Yeah, so that really gives you an insight into, as I said, it's a rough neighborhood. Thank you. Thank you very much for the insight before and after the film. Thank you for taking the time for this interview. And with that, I will now hand back to the host on site, and I hope that everyone is enjoying the film festival.